Welcome to Reason Unveiled. Today, we're diving into one of the biggest questions in human history. Was Jesus real? Not was he the Son of God? Not did he rise from the dead? But the very basic yet groundbreaking question, did Jesus even exist as a historical person at all? Now, if you grew up in a Christian environment, you've probably been told since childhood that Jesus was a real person who walked the earth around 2,000 years ago. You might have seen Sunday school pictures of him: tall, white skin, flowing brown hair, blue eyes, like some model straight out of a shampoo commercial. And you were told that beyond all the miracles, the resurrection, and the theology, Jesus himself is a firmly established historical figure. But here's the shocking part. The actual evidence for the historical Jesus is incredibly thin. And I don't mean a little thin, I mean shockingly fragile. So fragile that if the exact same standards of evidence were applied to any other supposed figure in history, historians would laugh it out of the room. So let's start with the most basic point. There are no contemporary accounts of Jesus. No one who lived during the supposed lifetime of Jesus, say 04 BCE to 30 CE, wrote a single word about him. Not a Roman historian, not a Jewish scholar, not a Greek philosopher, nobody. This man, who was supposedly performing jaw-dropping miracles in front of crowds of thousands, raising the dead, walking on water, shaking up the political and religious authorities of the time, apparently left no trace in the records of his own era. Think about that for a second. The Romans were obsessive record keepers. They documented everything from tax records, to executions, to rebellions, to minor religious sects. Judea, where Jesus supposedly lived, was a hotbed of political tension under Roman occupation. Messianic movements weren't rare. In fact, they were common, and the Romans usually crushed them with force. Yet, not one single Roman record mentions Jesus of Nazareth. You'd think if someone was entering Jerusalem with cheering crowds, causing riots in the temple, and then being crucified under Pontius Pilate, there would be a line or two somewhere in the official accounts. But there's nothing. Silence. Now, some Christians argue, but the Gospels record it. And yes, the Gospels do. But here's the problem. The Gospels are not contemporary accounts. They were written decades after the events they describe. The earliest Gospel, Mark, is believed to have been written around 70 CE, about 40 years after Jesus' supposed crucifixion. 40 years. Imagine trying to write a biography of someone today without the internet, without archives, without newspapers, just stories passed down orally for decades. How accurate would that be? Not to mention, the Gospels are anonymous. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were assigned much later by church tradition. We don't actually know who wrote them. Scholars agree they were written by educated Greek-speaking Christians, not Aramaic-speaking peasants from Galilee. That means they weren't eyewitnesses. Now, here's another kicker. The Gospels contradict each other. A lot different genealogies for Jesus, different versions of events, different last words on the cross, different details about who found the empty tomb and when. If these were eyewitness accounts, you'd expect some consistency. But what we see looks more like different communities shaping stories to fit their own theological needs. So, if the Gospels are unreliable and late, what about outside sources? Surely there must be some mention of Jesus in the works of historians from that period, right? This is where names like Josephus and Tacitus usually get thrown around. Josephus was a Jewish historian writing in the late 1st century. He does mention Jesus in his book, Antiquities of the Jews. But here's the problem. The passage that mentions Jesus, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, is almost certainly tampered with by later Christian scribes. The language in that passage is way too Christian for a Jewish historian who never converted to Christianity. Most scholars admit at least parts of it are forged, and if you take out the obvious Christian insertions, what remains is vague and could easily be referring to some obscure preacher, not the Jesus of Christianity. Then there's Tacitus, a Roman historian writing around 116 CE. He mentions that Christians followed Christus, who was executed under Pontius Pilate. But again, Tacitus was writing almost a century after the supposed events, and it's very likely he was just repeating what Christians of his own time already believed. He wasn't an eyewitness. He wasn't digging through Roman archives. He was simply reporting hearsay. In other words, the so-called evidence outside the Bible is late, vague, and in some cases, tampered with. Now, Let's put this into perspective with some real-world examples. Compare Jesus to Julius Caesar. Caesar lived around the same time period, and we have tons of contemporary accounts of his life. We have coins with his face. We have statues. We have his own writings. For Alexander the Great, who lived even earlier, we have inscriptions, cities named after him, and a vast historical footprint. But for Jesus, nothing. No contemporary writings, no inscriptions, no artifacts, no coins, not even a single mention from anyone alive when he supposedly lived. Some defenders of the historical Jesus will say, well, he was just a poor carpenter. Why would anyone write about him? But remember, this isn't just a carpenter we're talking about. This is someone who, according to the Bible, drew massive crowds, performed impossible miracles, angered powerful religious elites, and was executed by Rome. The idea that all of that could happen without a single contemporary historian noticing is highly suspicious. Here's another red flag. The story of Jesus looks suspiciously like a patchwork of earlier myths. Virgin births, miracle workers, dying and rising gods. These weren't new ideas in the ancient world. Horus, Mithras, Dionysus, and others had similar legends. Christianity seems to have borrowed heavily from existing traditions, reshaping them into a new story centered around Jesus. Even the resurrection, the core of Christianity, isn't unique. Many ancient religions had gods who died and came back to life. It was a symbolic theme of renewal, tied to agriculture and the cycles of nature. So, when we see the Jesus story, it doesn't scream unique historical event. It screams mythic archetype repackaged. And here's the irony. The earliest Christian writings we have aren't the Gospels at all. They're the letters of Paul, written around 50 CE. But Paul never met Jesus. He never quotes Jesus' teachings. He doesn't describe his miracles, his parables, or even his life story. Instead, Paul talks about visions of a spiritual Christ, almost as if Jesus was more of a divine figure, revealed in mystical experiences than a flesh and blood man walking in Galilee. That's huge, because it suggests that Christianity may have started as a mystical belief in a heavenly savior, and only later did the detailed biographies get written to flesh out the story. So, when you strip away the assumptions, what are we left with? A late, contradictory set of anonymous writings, a handful of tempered references from non-Christian sources, and a suspicious resemblance to earlier myths. That's not exactly solid evidence for the existence of the most important figure in Western religion, and yet, the belief persists. Why? Because once a myth gets institutionalized, once it becomes the foundation of empires, churches, and entire civilizations, it takes on a life of its own. People stop asking, did this really happen? And instead ask, how do we live according to this story? But that's not history, that's tradition. So, if the evidence for Jesus is this thin, why do so many historians still assume he must have existed in some form? Well, here's the honest truth. Many of them aren't actually working from hard evidence, they're working from tradition. For centuries, questioning the existence of Jesus wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. Whole academic careers could be destroyed by suggesting the story might be mythical. And even today, in universities, openly denying the historicity of Jesus can mean losing credibility, not because the evidence is strong, but because the cultural weight of Christianity is so overwhelming. There's also what I'd call the minimalist fallback. This is where historians say, okay, maybe the miracles and the resurrection are myths, but surely there was at least some guy at the root of it all, a preacher or rabbi named Jesus, who started the movement. But here's the catch. That's not evidence. That's an assumption. It's like saying, there must have been a real King Arthur somewhere, just because there are stories about him. But when you actually look for the evidence of Arthur, it evaporates. The same thing happens with Jesus. Now let's get really practical. Imagine if tomorrow someone claimed that 50 years ago, in your city, there was a man who walked on water, healed the blind, raised the dead, and was executed by the government in front of crowds of people. Imagine being told that thousands witnessed this. Wouldn't you expect there to be newspapers, official records, eyewitness accounts, maybe even a photo or two? If not newspapers, at least some diaries, letters, or records from skeptics of the time. Yet when we look at the first century, we find none of this for Jesus, none. Instead, what we find is that Christianity grew in the decades after the supposed time of Jesus, mostly through oral tradition. And oral tradition is notoriously unreliable. Stories change, they grow, they get exaggerated. Think about a game of telephone played by a small group of kids. By the end, the message is completely distorted. Now imagine that game stretched over decades, across languages, across different cultures, with people adding in miracles to make the story more powerful. It's not hard to see how a myth could snowball into what we now call the Gospels. And if you want more evidence that stories can create entire belief systems, just look at modern examples. Think of Joseph Smith, who founded Mormonism in the 19th century, claiming to have golden plates revealed by an angel. Millions follow that story today. Or think of Scientology, which started from the writings of a science fiction author, yet now has global influence. Humans are story-driven creatures. We don't just live in history, we live in narratives. So when people say, "But there had to be someone at the root of Christianity," I ask, why? Myths don't need a historical seed. Myths can emerge entirely as stories, shaped by cultural needs, and then treated as history later. And here's something else most people don't realize. The image of Jesus that dominates today isn't even consistent with the earliest Christian traditions. Early Christian groups had wildly different versions of Jesus. Some saw him as purely divine and never human. Others saw him as human but not divine. Some thought he was a spirit who only appeared human. These debates were so fierce that entire sects of Christianity were eventually declared heretical and wiped out. If there had been a clear historical figure whose life was well known, why was there so much disagreement so early on? The truth is, the Jesus story worked not because it was historically solid, but because it was adaptable. It gave people hope. It offered meaning in a harsh world. It promised eternal life, justice for the oppressed, and victory over death. That's powerful stuff. And when the Roman Empire eventually adopted Christianity, the story of Jesus became the story of an empire, written into law, tradition, and education for centuries. By then, questioning whether he even existed became unthinkable. Now, does this mean that we can say with absolute certainty that Jesus never existed? No, absolute certainty is almost impossible in ancient history. But here's what we can say. The evidence for Jesus' existence is no stronger than the evidence for countless other mythical figures, and in some cases, it's even weaker. If we were being intellectually honest, we'd admit that the case for Jesus as a historical figure is shaky at best, and the case for Jesus as a divine figure is non-existent. So, what do we do with this? Well, understanding that the Jesus story may be more myth than history doesn't mean we can't learn from it. It doesn't mean we can't study its influence or examine the moral and cultural values it has shaped, but it does mean we should stop pretending the evidence is stronger than it really is. It means we should be willing to ask the uncomfortable question, what if the story isn't true? Because here's the bottom line. Truth doesn't need protecting. Truth doesn't fear questions. If a story crumbles under scrutiny, maybe it wasn't truth to begin with. And that brings us back to our original question. Was Jesus real? Based on the evidence, or lack of it, the most honest answer is probably not, or at the very least, not in the way we've been told. And if that unsettles you, remember this: the goal of seeking truth isn't comfort. It's clarity. History is full of myths that people once swore were real, but the real progress happens when we have the courage to separate myth from fact. So if you found this eye-opening, don't stop here. There's so much more to uncover about how religion shaped history, how myths evolve into facts, and how critical thinking helps us peel back the layers of tradition. Stay tuned, because in the next videos, we're going to go even deeper into the roots of belief, the business of religion, and the stories that continue to shape our world. This is Reason Unveiled. Keep watching, and never stop questioning.